Welcome to the Reddit Chronicles. Today we will be reading from TrueOffMyChest. Our first post is by Capable Elephant. 2 tampons may mean my marriage is over. I, 29F, have been with my husband, 30M, for 7 years, married for 4. I've never had reason to suspect he was unfaithful to me or even remotely dissatisfied with our marriage. He likes to joke that we're still living the honeymoon phase, nearly 5 years and 2 kids in. I wouldn't have questioned that, or him, were it not for a surprise I found in his car last month. When buckling our daughter into her car seat, I noticed something slotted between the cushions. I pulled it out and saw that it was a tampon. This wouldn't have been so unusual had I not had an IUD that has stopped my period for the past year, and I didn't even recognize the wrapper style. I brought it to my husband's attention, and he didn't seem to understand what it was, let alone why I was holding it, until I told him where I'd found it and why I was almost certain it wasn't mine. He shrugged and said it probably belonged to his coworker, Fiona. It's not uncommon for my husband to carpool to lunch with his coworkers, and we're both fairly close to Fiona and her husband, so I figured it was entirely possible the tampon had slipped out of her purse whenever he had driven with them or offered her a ride. No big deal. I put it out of my mind until we had dinner with Fiona and her husband a couple weeks later. I had sincerely wanted to believe my husband. I just couldn't get over the way it had been tucked in the seat, and how my husband had seemed not to have any regard for it whatsoever. Maybe playing dumb. I don't know. I did something that I now feel kind of crazy for doing. I faked an emergency and asked Fiona if she had any tampons while we were out together. She handed me one almost identical to the tampon I'd found in our backseat, and I breathed a sigh of relief. So the tampon there was probably the same tampon here, and in all likelihood, there was an innocent explanation as to why it had been left in the backseat in the first place. I thought I'd seen the last of the out-of-place feminine hygiene products until I found another tampon this morning, this time in my sock drawer. I feel physically ill at the thought of my husband having an affair, and even more nauseated at the thought that the woman might have left these tampons out for me to find. If it was my husband's coworker, why would she give herself away by offering me one the other night? In any other situation, I would want to talk to my husband about this, but I feel too sick and embarrassed to approach him with what I've found. What should I do? It may help knowing how old OP's children are, as this information could provide context regarding the potential misplacement of tampons from previous incidents. An open conversation between OP and her husband is going to be needed in order to find a reasonable explanation and discover the truth. Communication is key in any relationship. Our next post is by Nightmare BXmas. Woman obsessed with my husband tried to break up my marriage, got hit by karma. 16 years ago, my husband and I were married with a 1-year-old little girl. We were high school sweethearts that went to different schools, met junior year and made it work. Where we went to different school, I met John through my husband, but never met Sarah or Cindy. Still haven't met them in real life. One night my daughter and I spent the night at my sister's house with her 2 kids because her husband was out of town for work and she was heavily pregnant and needed help the night he would be gone. That night my husband's best friend John, been friends since 2nd grade, came over to our house to hang out with him. Next day my husband told me John's ex-girlfriend, Sarah, and her best friend, Cindy, came over to see John. John was already with a new girlfriend, Sandy, and that while John slept with Sarah in our spare bedroom, Cindy had tried to sleep with my tipsy husband. He kicked them out at like 2 a.m. My husband turned Cindy down, but apparently she had always had a crush on my husband. For a year afterwards, she would call his phone. Didn't know how she got his number. We changed his number twice. She kept getting it and calling, playing music, saying lewd things, even sending emails saying how our daughter needed to be put down so she didn't end up being a bee like me. That they would jump me and bash my daughter's head in if they saw us out alone. Kept sending updates on where I went, asked how my doctor's appointment was, how store name was, Creepy stalker stuff. For the longest time, I refused to leave the house without my husband because I was seriously concerned they would hurt my daughter. For a year, I felt trapped in my home. I vividly remember being 3 weeks postpartum after an emergency C-section with our second child and just holding my baby and sliding down the wall to sit and cry because she had called again. It was 2 or 3 times a week she would call. She always blocked her number and sent the emails from an anonymous email address. For a while, I thought maybe my husband was talking to her. How else would she be getting his new numbers? I lost so much faith in him. I know he was mad about the situation and would scream into the phone to leave us alone. I saved every call log, email, and recorded what I could. I sent an email to her throwaway and said I knew who she was and that I was going to the police for harassment. Spoiler alert, I already tried, but there wasn't enough evidence because she blocked her number and nothing traced back to her. However, we were 20. She was 19 and it scared her enough to leave us alone. 3 months of peace later, and his best friend John came over with Sandy for dinner. Sandy and I were friends and would talk about everything with the crazies, as we called them. She asked how everything with Cindy was going, and I asked her how she forgave John for sleeping with Sarah. She lost it because she didn't know. He lies, says he didn't, and that my husband got it wrong, that they were just talking. Sandy didn't believe him, and then John screamed at me. This is why I kept giving Cindy his number. She would be a better match for him. My husband threw John out and they yelled at each other outside for a while. Turns out John was upset my husband wasn't going out and partying with him. John thought it was me not allowing my husband to go. But that wasn't true. My husband didn't want to go. He preferred to be home with me and our daughter. The few times he went out with John, they first practically had to kick him out of the house to get him to go. John couldn't understand it was my husband who didn't want to go clubbing. My husband has never been a clubbing guy. He hates people and loud music. He kicked John out of our lives that night, and husband hasn't spoken to him since. We changed his number one last time and never had any other issues. For her part, Cindy got some serious karma. I couldn't help but laugh when I learned she married a guy a year later, had a kid, and got cheated on, and then he left her for another woman while she was pregnant. I usually don't enjoy others' misfortunes. However, after the hell she put us through, especially during my pregnancy with our second child, I laughed when I heard. For John, he married Sandy, has 2 kids now, and tried to get back in contact with us 13 years ago after he had his first kid. He wanted to apologize because apparently after having his own kid, he realized how screwed up he was doing what he did. He called my husband's parents because they still had a landline at the time. My in-laws had already been told years earlier what happened, and that under no circumstances were they to give out our numbers to him. So we went to my in-laws, and my husband called him back and told him to never contact our family again. Side note, when husband called John back, we found out Cindy wasn't following us like we thought. John would tell her where we were going. So screw you, John. You and that psycho Cindy. In my opinion, Sandy should run for the hills after knowing what John did to OP and her family. OP's husband, on the other hand, is a keeper, throwing out his longtime friend and supporting OP through everything. Our next post is by Cranberry Freya. My parents abandoned me at 4, and now they want me back. I, 17F, have lived with my aunt, 49F, and my uncle, 52M, since my mother, 39F, and my father, 48M, left me there once I was 4. For this story, I'll need to go back in time. I was born an only child up until my little sister Evie, 15F, was born. The thing about Evie is that she had a high risk of not surviving birth, and when she did, the doctors told our parents that she was most likely not going to live past 2. Well, she did. Evie was very hard to take care of, and even harder to take care of with both of us. After 2 years of being parents to both of us, they just gave up on me. They brought me to my aunt and uncle's house and never picked me up again. I had no idea what happened for me. It was just one sleepover turned into way more. When I was 10, they finally let me in on why I had been there for the past 6 years. To say I was pissed was an understatement. I was livid, I punched the walls, and I cut up my only picture with my mother and father. I promised myself that I will never speak to them again. That's when I started calling my uncle and aunt mom and dad. I still do. I just thought it would be easier for you to read if I just addressed them as my uncle and aunt. I saw my parents briefly, a couple of times throughout the years, but I never talked to them. Yesterday, I saw my parents and little sister come over to our house with a gift. Long story short, since my sister lived to 15, they weren't worried anymore and wanted me back like the old times. I told them to go F themselves, and my real parents were in the kitchen. My dad just got pissed and yelled at me saying, "How dare I talk to my parents like that?" I told them they stopped being my parents when they left me at my aunt and uncle's house, and I'd like it to stay that way. My mom just cried and said she was so sorry but she couldn't take care of me. I just laughed and said, obviously. A lot of other things were said, but I think you get the idea of what awful stuff me and my dad said to each other. But in the end, they left sobbing. My aunt and uncle didn't know what happened, so I told them. They said they were happy, I wouldn't be leaving them, but they thought I should have let them down slowly. Edit, I am going to answer some replies. First off, I'm changing my parents' names to Jack and Mary because I haven't called them mom and dad since I was 10, and I'm not going to start now. My true parents will be called Susan and Mark. Well, people were saying that my little sister Evie needed an organ like a liver or a kidney. Well, I see where this could be very possible, but I think they might have mentioned that when I met them as a way to guilt trip me. Another one was that Evie can't have kids but they still want grandchildren. Well, Evie is 15, so she won't be having kids for a long time if she can. I also won't be having kids, hopefully, until I am at least in my late 20s. A comment on that said she might need a surgeon. The last one I'm going to talk about is the possibility that they need a guardian for Evie. I just need to clarify, I still love my sister Evie. I know it's not her fault for our parents being jerks. So if she did need someone to help her or a place to stay, she is welcome with us. Thanks for all the support, and for those saying don't go back to them, don't worry, I know I never will. Thank you for listening to the Reddit Chronicles. Follow for more content.